Sydney, Australia, Tasmania, we've got Canberra, we've got Los Angeles, that's Glenn. What else? Where have we got you? Where are you? Aaron says yes, so that's good. Where else are you logging in from? Let's see, Melbourne. Hi, Annie. Karen in Tasmania, Victoria and Byron Bay. Yeah, Tasmania. Brisbane. So we're representing a fair few Australian states here. Colorado, US. Ray, welcome. So we've got a few people from the US. Mark in LA. Hobart, that's Paul. We usually also have some Italians. Have we got any Italians on the call today? Italians and people from Britain as well. No one from the UK? No one from Italy today? Because we had about 133 registrations and we've got 63 people live now. All right, so without further ado, because we've been struggling with this for about 5 minutes, I'm going to just run through a few things. Now, this was an issue at my end. Now, it can happen that there's something wrong at your end. Okay, so if you're the only one who seems to have a problem, then maybe just reconnect or disconnect or reconnect. There should be a button at the bottom of your page, of your screen. I apologize. I sent a funny email yesterday that was referring to the productivity webinar, which we did 2 weeks ago. Sorry about that. Your email this morning should have had the right topic list for today. There'll be Q&A time at the end. During presentation, it's going to be tough because I don't see the chat box, and it's just easier to get everything out. It's going to be full on. This is the most complete presentation I've ever done on synopsis, and synopsis is pretty important. At the end, I'm going to make a few offers. Those people who missed the last presentation on productivity, will offer you the ebook and the replay of the webinar, and there's also a worksheet and a checklist attached to that. And then the very first webinar we did on adaptation, you can also purchase that ebook at the end of this session. And that's all at a lower price than you will normally find in the shop online. Good. I'm going to start sharing my screen and see how that goes. And then I'll walk you through that presentation. Let's see, is this the one? There's a few here. If this is the one, yeah, it could be. No, I don't think it is. No, I'm gonna just do. It was. Okay, that's good. So yeah, that's what we need to show. You see, learning. All right. So first of all, the synopsis is an extremely important document because, as some of you will have already found out, it can make the difference between getting your film financed or not, getting your film made or not, getting your screenplay read, because mostly people will read the synopsis, first the logline, then the synopsis, before they read the screenplay. So it's pretty important. Now, I've always hated writing it, or I used to hate writing it. I regularly do reviews, assessments for the Australian Writers Guild, and they want us to write a synopsis of the screenplay that we've read. Now, when the story doesn't work, it is virtually impossible to write a proper synopsis within 1 page. By the way, an aside, synopsis, S-I-S at the end, synopses is plural. Okay, so synopses, S-E-S, that's plural of synopsis. So for the Writers Guild, I had to write those, and if the story doesn't work, it's just really, really difficult because there's no logic between the events. And that's why the synopsis is so powerful. You can, from that 1-pager, you can see whether a story will not work. So you can eliminate. If the synopsis works, it's a good indication that the screenplay might work. So it's really an eliminative document. Now, the synopsis is the son of the logline, or the daughter of the logline, if you wish, because first you write a logline. The logline tests the concept. Logline really only has main character, flaw, inciting incident, and the goal, so the gist of the story. But how that is executed in the synopsis, we'll find out a little bit more about that. And ideally, you should tell that synopsis as if it were a story in its own right, a full story. What that means is that it's not just a summary of your screenplay. It's really a story in its own right. If you can do that, you will have a better chance of entertaining the reader during the reading of the synopsis. And then obviously that will lead to reading the script with a greater chance. So it's a story in its own right. And if you were to tell that synopsis as a story, it would roughly take 3 minutes, which is the duration of a good short film. In other words, if you were to write a synopsis for a short film, it's going to be much easier than for a feature, because in the short film, you will cover pretty much everything. 500 words, that's my ideal word count. We'll get to that in a minute. In a screenplay, you've got about 20,000 words, so you have to do it in what, 1/40th, so that's 2.5% of the whole word count of the script. Whereas if you have a 3-minute short film, that's 3 pages, so that should be roughly also about 500 words. So you're not going to be summarizing much. But if you do, even TV episodes of 20 or 25 or 50 or an hour, you're still going to struggle to get that all in those 500 words. Now I'm going to give you the techniques to deal with those limitations. Now I am keeping an eye on the chat, and Angeline, you say that your reception is patchy. Sorry about that. And I am recording it. Okay, so this will be made available as a replay. It will be for free. The replay will be free for everyone who's on the call today. People who miss it will have to pay a small amount. But everyone who's with us now, if you have trouble hearing or seeing, you can watch the replay for free. So back to the synopsis. It's a story. Try to tell it as a story. And maybe you should try that exercise. Try how it works to tell that story in 3 minutes, record it, write it down, and see how that is. And another good aspect of doing that exercise is you will train yourself in making logical connections between the events. That is, I find, the trickiest part of it, to make those the abbreviated events still connect, and we'll get to that. As you write your synopsis, you may find out that your concept needs tweaking. Okay, you may have to go back to your logline, revisit your logline, or vice versa. As you've written your synopsis and you're writing your screenplay, and you find that in the course of the writing of the screenplay, you're going a new direction for one part of the story, then go back to your synopsis, rewrite it, keep those documents in sync. Now, that's not just because I'm pedantic and I want you to have a perfect story pack, so to speak, story pack being logline, synopsis, treatment, and script, but you will see that once you come back from the screenplay to the synopsis, it's often really hard to make those changes in the shorter document. And you have to demonstrate that it still works within the 500 words, that there's still a logic that you can communicate in 3 minutes. If your changes in the screenplay have a major effect on your summary and you can't summarize a story anymore, it's very likely that there still is a problem with the story. Now, if you're very experienced, obviously you may be able to do that, and if you have had a few films under your belt, you may get away with writing longer synopses. But initially, keep those documents in sync. When you change something in your script, go back to the synopsis. Can you still summarize it? Does it still make sense? That's a big one. The word count. Many of you try to go over the 500 words, and it's all, I know, you can always just get that one thing in that you want to communicate if you do 600 words or 650 or 550. Now try to stick to 500 for a number of reasons. A page gets very cluttered if it becomes more than 500 words. It becomes longer to read, and people who have to read a lot will be inclined less to read your a page and a half than the page. Now, obviously, the 500 words is not an absolute. If you go over a little bit, that's fine. But try to limit yourself. Try to discipline yourself. Now, let's have a look what that would look like and how you would ultimately execute it. Now, this is you can start with a 3-page. All right, a 3-page has about 1,500 words. If you keep to the 500 words a page, and And this is what that would look like if you would squeeze it all on one page. I've seen people try. I've seen people do it by minimizing the font. So you start with a longer synopsis. It's much easier to first write your 3 pages or 5 pages, I don't care, 10, and then trim back. Okay, so 3-page would be 1,500 words. Then you go to a 2-pager, that is about 1,000 words. And then ultimately you get to what you want, which is the 1-pager. And the beautiful number of 500 words. And the 500 words, as I said, is about 3 minutes. What do you need to squeeze in that word count? What are the things that you absolutely need to cover? I want to see the setting. The setting, Sydney, present day. Then you tell the entire story, beginning to end. You tell that story chronologically in the present tense. All right, these are the basics. These are absolute basics. You open with the setting, then you tell the full story chronologically, end with the present tense. I'm going through the 3 acts, and in this summary, I'll tell you what needs to go in there. I'll give you a little bit more detail about Act 1, a little bit less about Act 2 and 3. And the reason will become clear. So as I said, in Act 1, you open with the setting. Setting, sometimes it's clear. You don't need to spend many words. That could be just, as I said, Sydney, Australia, present day. If your setting is some fictional location, it's sci-fi, or it is an alternate reality, dystopian reality, then you need a few more words, and that's fine. And that's why that first act is going to be a little bit longer. So you may need longer than just a few words for the setting, but the setting needs to be clear because it's got to do with tone and genre. Then comes a character. Could be fairly simple. My students know that I have a very simple approach to character. There's only 3 things we really need to know. That's the physiognomy, the physicality, what they look like. There's the sociology, how they fit in society, where they stand, and the psychology, which is the most important one, because that's related to behavior and that's how we see the character act. That's critically important. They must all feature in the first few lines of your synopsis. Okay, so once you've focused on the setting, you go straight to character. How do you do that? You don't necessarily just describe the character, but you could describe an action that the character does and describe the character in the course of that action. But you need to do it in a minimal amount of time. And again, train yourself. Train yourself in brevity, concision. Learn how to set up a character very briefly, very concisely. Once you've got a character, you're going to describe the current situation, the opening situation for that character. In Hero's Journey, it's the ordinary world. We need to understand that. Too often, and this is less an issue of synopsis, more an issue of story, too often that's going to be boring. They're going to really make it ordinary. Now, ordinary means what is the normal world for the character. For the character to deserve to be in a movie, that needs to be interesting. Okay. Marty in Back to the Future is just a school kid, but he's got an interesting life. It's fun, and there's stuff going on in his current situation. So describe where your character is at the beginning of the story, keep it interesting, and make sure that in the course of that description, in the course of the actions you describe, we get a good feel for that character. Now, part of that current situation is also the character flaw. So you're going to interweave that. So character and current situation, they're gonna interweave in that ordinary world. And then that will all lead to the inciting incident. That's the collision course, I like to call it, because of the character flaw, which you mostly have. Mostly you'll have, if you have a feature film, you'll have transformational characters. Less the case in television, obviously, and short films. But typically, you will then have your inciting incident, and that is irrespective of your format. You need an inciting incident because the reader needs to understand that the story is starting. Where that fits in your synopsis, how much words you need to dedicate, I'm going to show you very, very precisely. And it'll be visual, it'll be very clear. Then you give your character's initial response to that inciting incident. That can be called the refusal of the call, or a flawed response, as Michael Arendt calls it, but it needs to be in your synopsis. How does your character respond to that first event, the major event that kicks off the story? And next, as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, really, you need to establish the goal. We need to know what this story is going to be about, what your character is going to try and achieve. And with that, we end Act 1. And we go into Act 2. But let's look at the overview. So that's your first act, setting in character. That's about roughly the amount of space you will dedicate to it. They kind of interweave with the current situation, and then we lead to the inciting incident. We'll talk about sequences in a minute, and you'll see that this may conclude the first sequence. Then you go into the second sequence with the response of the character to that inciting incident, and then the goal is established. And that's the end of Act 1. Now we go into Act 2. Act 2, deliberately, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's so different. It's different for every story, and it's really, increasing complications, increasing tension, building to the midpoint, building to sequence climaxes. It's important that I can distinguish in your synopsis your Act 2A. I need to understand how your story is built, and if you have structured your story as a transformational journey, then we need to see how the character behaves in that second act all the way to the midpoint. That needs to be clear in the synopsis. And you set that apart, even visually, even with paragraphs. Act 2A leads to the midpoint. I call it the midpoint reversal, because in great stories, everything changes, everything flips. And after the midpoint, we have Act 2B. Together, they make up Act 2. And, it's funny how these proportions seem to be quite academic, but let me tell you this, I didn't start with these proportions. I actually started with a real synopsis that I wrote. I wrote a synopsis for a film and then looked visually how much space did it take, and this is the result. So this is an actual film summarized. In a minute we'll look at which one it is. You may have already figured it out from the word spaghetti you saw earlier on. And then we go into Act 3. Very simple. Act 3 is really building to the climax as quickly as possible. That you may have at the beginning a threshold journey. You know that I love those. Recently published an article about the threshold in Sicario, which I can highly recommend. Even if you don't like the film, study the threshold and see how the thresholds delineate the various story parts. So Act 3 starts with the climax, ends with the aftermath, which is optional according to Robert McKee. He says that European films don't have them. Well, these days you see them even in European films. And that's Act 3, very simple. Most of it will take the climax and a little bit aftermath. So here's your overview, and in the background you will see appear the synopsis I wrote for Nightcrawler. So this is all applied to Nightcrawler. And as I wrote the synopsis, I realized how amazingly beautiful that story is told, because it lends itself really easily to a synopsis. Now, I only cheated once. We'll get to that later on. I only cheated once, and it may need a few more words, but I'm sure that I can trim those words elsewhere. It's exactly 500 words, by the way. So this is what the synopsis would look like, Act 1, 2, 3, with those various elements. We're going into structure a little bit more later on, or rather how you lay it out. Theme, what do you do with theme in your synopsis? Well, ideally, I would say the theme needs to be clear by itself. You're not going to mention the theme. You're not going to say this is a film about. Typically, we would understand what the theme is from the main character's behavior, from the character's flaw. I see Trish watched Sicario this morning. Well, great. Watch it again and again. Yeah, Paul wants to do the autobiography of the character. That's great, because that's what it's really about. Clive, about chronology, we'll get to that in a minute. So theme, I wouldn't state it explicitly, because if you need to do that, then probably there's something wrong with your story, and you won't have the space. You simply don't have the word count available to mention the theme. Another thing is that very rarely do films sell on theme. Films sell on character and story, not on theme. So you can easily leave that out, I find. All right, let's talk a few more minutes about structure, because, I like structure. So, as we said, Act 1. And now you can read with me. Now these, if it is legible, if you can read the words, this is not my final draft of this synopsis. We'll talk about the various versions in a minute. Act 2 is about twice as long as Act 1. Now, this is coincidence. And I'll explain. If we look at the proportion in this particular synopsis, it's almost perfect, 25%, 50%, and 25%. It's almost as if Michael Hague wrote this synopsis, because he is big in percentages. I'm not. I think there should be certain flexibility, fluidity, and different stories require different proportions. Here, it just fell into place the way you see it here. Typically, your first act will look somewhat more like this. It'll be more like 33%, a third of your story, all right? Because you need more time to set up. As I mentioned earlier, that setup of the character is so important. The setup of your setting may be important. And before you know, you're actually heading towards that midpoint of your synopsis, which is pretty scary, I know, but it's fine. You can summarize that second act, because if your concept is strong, people will get it. People will understand that you have material to show in that second act. But Act 1 and Act 3 are critically important, so you may have to dedicate proportionally more word count, more page real estate to those acts. This is another approach, and this is the sequence approach. Again, entirely coincidentally, I did not deliberately pick Nightcrawler because it's so simple. I just picked the first one that came up and that I'd watched fairly recently. When you read the book Screenwriting, the Sequence Approach by Paul Golino, you'll learn that the most typical structure is the 8-sequence structure. If you were to look at stories and break them down into sequences, mostly they will have 8 sequences. Nightcrawler has 9, and it's because I've set apart the mid-sequence. Now, again, this is not a class in story structure, and if I were to properly analyze Nightcrawler, I may change my mind. This is just about the synopsis. This is how you could do it. So in your synopsis, you could set apart these synopses, and that, again, makes the read easier, because basically you are writing towards sequence climaxes, increasing climaxes. And if you follow the sequence structure, you'll typically have 2 sequences in your first act. First one ends on Inciting Incident, second act ends on the goal established, end of Act 1. Then you've got 2 sequences in Act A1, and then here in this one, you've got a separate mid-sequence, and then 2 sequences towards the end of Act 2. And then in Act 3, you've got a climax sequence and an aftermath sequence. Again, this is an average. And as you know, averages don't exist. Very often you've got 9, 10, 11, 12 sequence movies, and you've got movies with less sequences. I think North by Northwest only had, no, I'm not going to say it. I was going to say 3, but I'm wrong there. Anyway, what I want to show you, however, is what it would look like when I highlight the climaxes. These are the climaxes in Nightcrawler. So at the end of each sequence, there's a major event that bookends that sequence, and that makes it easy to write the synopsis in this way. Don't look at the font. This is, again, just for a demonstration. A little later, I'll show you the actual synopsis as I printed it. Layout and format, that's what I want to show you. Now, this is the block of text. And this is an example of a literal printed synopsis, 12-point font. I think it's Arial. You don't use Courier. You don't have to use Courier. In fact, Courier doesn't really read very well. It's not easy on the eye, so you would use something else. And do some research there, because psychologically, some fonts read easier than others. If you're giving a printed synopsis, you may use a different font. Again, do your research, because you'll use a different font for a printed synopsis than a synopsis that's read on the computer. There's a whole science behind the use of font. So do your research there. It's beyond the scope of this webinar, but it's worth looking into. And I might even do it for the ebook. But I wanted to show you here is that if you subdivide your synopsis in 4, you can have a 12-point font, which is nice and large. It's the natural, typical font you would use. It reads really easily, and you can still have your 4 acts, so to speak, or Act 2A and Act 2B, and you can have your title on the page. Look at that. So you got your title, you got a blank line, and then the 4 acts. Now here's another example, another way of looking at it. Here I have indented the sequences. By doing that, I'm using more page real estate. As a result, I cannot fit the title on the page. So what you could do here is obviously make your font smaller. Some people have trouble reading anything smaller than 12 point. I don't mind anything down to 10. All right. I often print at 10 point, but 12 is ideal. 11 is, I would say, still acceptable. But this is what happens if you're going to indent your sequences. It means that you have to be even stricter on your 500 words. In this one, I create blank lines between, so line breaks between the acts, and immediately visually on the page, it shows me the structure of the film. And I'm a structure nut, and so are quite a few professionals, definitely in Hollywood. So you can make their lives easy by structuring or laying out your synopsis this way. For this, I had to go back to 11 point. Right? I still have the title at the top. Then I have Act 1, Act 2A, including the midpoint, Act 2B, and Act 3. Maybe this is my favorite. I really like this one. So if I were to pick, I'd probably read this one before all the others. Here's yet another opportunity, the 6 stages. That's Michael Haig. So exactly the same I did before, only here, instead of acts, I have the stages. What are they? First stage leading up to Inciting Incident, second stage leading up to end of Act 1, then the first half of Act 2, second half of Act 2, and then climax, and then resolution. Now here, I'm a little bit off with the third act, as you can see, because the break should be lower. The aftermath is shorter than the climax. So that was about layout. Again, that will all be printed in the ebook, so you don't need to take notes now. The ebook, however, I have to say, is at an additional cost. You can look at this replay as many times as you like. Names. What do you do with names? Well, again, a few practices. Most of what I give you during this webinar is my own experience. What I've seen, how I respond to it, what I find easy, and there's a few things that I've picked up left and right. But I don't think there is an absolute rule. If you look up synopses, story synopses, or plot synopses on IMDb for films, you'll find synopses that are 10,000 words, 14,000 words. So basically, that's a treatment. That's almost the entire story. You have synopses that detail the scenes in the film. Well, that's not what we understand as synopsis, And I should have mentioned that at the beginning. You can have a paragraph synopsis, you can have a page synopsis, or a 2-page synopsis. I think those are the most common ones. How do we handle names? When you have a lot of characters in your film, obviously you're in trouble because you're going to have a lot of names, and your reader is going to struggle telling them apart by the end of the synopsis. So you need to figure out how to deal with them. I would say the first recommendation is cut them out of the synopsis. Look at which characters you absolutely need to get the story across in 500 words. And you'll find there's quite a few supporting characters you need to cut out, some subplots you need to cut out. Then there's the issue of, are you going to use the name, the character name, or are you going to use the character function? Are you going to say Laura, or are you going to say Jim's mother? It depends. If Jim's mother is present in the first act and in the third act, and not so much in the second act, call her Jim's mother, because by the time we're in the third act, we forgot who Laura was. So keep those considerations. People read a lot of synopses, and it's very difficult to remember who was who. What do you do with capitalization? Now, here's an example. In Nightcrawler, there's only about 4 that have survived my synopsis. There's Lou, there's Loader, there's Nina Romina, and there's Rick. Those are the 4 characters in this story. And those are the only 4 I mentioned by name in the synopsis. So what I was going to mention was capitals. In a screenplay, and now listen carefully, because some of you may not have heard this and not have picked up, because too often I see people make mistakes against this. The first time we see a character appear on the screen, we capitalize the name to flag new character entering the story. This is not typically done in a synopsis. I say not typically. I've seen it done many times, and I don't mind. In fact, I like it. But that's just me, all right? Maybe it's good to remember who likes what, and then, write a synopsis for that person. I like capitals for a new character. Other people don't. Someone even told me it is not done. So apparently it is frowned upon. I don't mind it the first time the characters appear in the script, just as much as in the synopsis. So right, there you have it. Don't do it except if you send me a synopsis. Flashbacks. So that's Clive's question, I think, about chronology. Clive was asking, do you mean chronologically in the sense of how the story will unfold on the screen, or true chronology? I would say that in some cases you may have to stick to true chronology. You may have to reconstruct the linear chronology of your film, because if you're going to jump in 500 words, it may get confusing. All right, but sometimes it's essential. You can't possibly tell Memento chronological. You cannot possibly tell Pulp Fiction chronologically, because it's the essence of the film. You cannot tell Michael Clayton chronologically. See, so that's a call you need to make. As a rule, I like to see the story chronologically, because people will always reconstruct it. Even if you tell a story in flashbacks, people will reconstruct and will see, does it work? Where does this flashback sit? Does that work? Does that make sense? Would this character do this? And so forth. So it's a call you make. As a rule, you stick as closely to what viewers see on the screen, but you'll find that within 500 words, it's going to be extremely complicated. Because each time you introduce a flashback, on the screen visually, it's easy. On the page, it's very different. So what you could do is, if they're flashbacks because a character hallucinates or a character dreams, you could summarize that and say the character, repeatedly has the same dream, or the character repeatedly hallucinates. That's probably a second best solution. But as I said, the main rule is still you try and stick to the experience of the story, of the actual story. And if that includes flashbacks and you can fit it into 500 words, then go for your life. Writing style, super important, because it's the lubricant. It can really help stories that may not be absolutely massive blockbusters. It may help the reader getting interested. So your writing style better be damn interesting, damn entertaining, and really roping us in. And you keep in mind the 3 C's. 3 C's in my books are clarity, first and foremost, concision, and color. Clarity is the most important one. If we don't understand what your story is about, forget it. We're not going to be interested. Concision, brevity, economy is definitely the second most important quality, because that's how you tell stories for the screen. You boil down your story to the absolute minimum. You need to be able to do that in a synopsis. Thirdly, color. So once you are clear and you have trimmed it to the absolute basics, now try and make it interesting. And in fact, if you do this 1 and 2 properly, often you will have colorful words. Avoid to be, to have, to see, to walk, but use specific words the way you would do in a screenplay. So that's the 3 C's. That's your writing style. No room for error. It's only 500 words, so there should be 0 typos. Absolutely no mistakes. You must read and reread and proofread and have someone else read it. If you have mistakes in 500 words, you extrapolate that to a screenplay of 20,000 words, it's just not acceptable. So make sure that it grips us and there's nothing distracting us in the synopsis. A word about causation. Yeah, Ian, we'll get to questions in a minute. But what about causation? Everyone is familiar with cause and effect in the physical sense, in the sense of physics. Something happens, and as a result, the next thing happens. In court, we talk about causation. Someone does something, and then as a result, another character does that. So causation and culpability are very close. In a story, we need causation. We need to see that what a character does has impact on other characters. We need to see that actions by a character are motivated by actions of another character. That's just how stories work. So causation is a really, really important concept. Now, causation is the most important, the most difficult concept when you're writing your synopsis, because as you start trimming, you're actually cutting the links between the cause and the effect. And once you finish your synopsis, those links need to be restored. There needs to be a flow, a logical flow, an emotionally logical flow between what's written in that synopsis. And the more you cut, the greater the danger that you are cutting the causal links or the causational links between characters' actions. To fix this, there's a great exercise. You try to rewrite your synopsis in terms of an action, and then you use the words, therefore, so-and-so does this. As a result, so-and-so does this. Or because this happens, this character does this. And you use those words rather than then or and, which is neutral, which doesn't indicate any causation. So make sure your story is cohesive. It makes sense. And Nightcrawler is a wonderful example because it has that flow. You could write the synopsis like that. In fact, the whole screenplay is almost written like one sentence. So it has that cohesion in the screenplay, and you can recreate that cohesion fairly simply in the synopsis. When you have a strong story, it'll be easier to write that synopsis and respect that cohesion and that causation rather. So that's it. That's really the most important aspects of writing synopsis. So I wish I had my summary here, but I don't. So we'll just have to improvise it. I've spoken about what needs to go into the synopsis. I've spoken about the content. I've spoken about why it is important. I've spoken about the structure, how you lay it out, about the design, the layout, the format. I've spoken a bit about the style, the writing style. And as I said, all that I'll put together in the ebook, and I should in a minute. No, I don't have that for you guys yet. I'll email you when it's ready, but I've got that last time. But it's time for questions. So let's have a look at what we've got here in terms of questions. So I've already answered Clive's question. The next one here I can see is Ian. Ian asks if Memento, what to do with films like Memento and Irreversible. The more stories diverge from the mainstream, the harder it's going to be to summarize it. And when you have Memento and Irreversible, it's virtually impossible. So you will need more time. You will need more. You need to get interest from your reader another way, because I don't believe you can convincingly summarize it. You may have to do a lot of cheating. So you need to cheat by basically summarize whole sections and describe in one sentence what happens in a whole sequence, and then also describe the way in which it is presented. So you need to clarify Memento. You need to clarify that this is the condition of the character, and this is how the character experiences the world, but we know differently. So you're going to share with the reader what the viewer knows, not just what the character knows. Ian asks what my attitude is on adjectives. I don't have a strong opinion about adjectives, only I see the moment I become aware of them, they're not essential. So in a synopsis, you'll obviously write less adjectives than you will in a novel. Ultimately, it all comes down to, do you feel that you are adequately summarizing your story in 500 words? All right, the longer you work on it, the more natural it will seem what needs to go. Now that sounds like a cop-out, but as you get more experience, you'll see what I mean. We'll need adjectives. Obviously, we don't need to know the color of the car, but we need to know the emotion of the character, the tone at the key moments in the story. And then for that, you may need adjectives. Now, adverbs are often a bigger issue because they're so long. Clive, is there a different approach to writing a synopsis as part of developing a screenplay as opposed to writing a synopsis for a script you've already written? Great question. Yes, there's a big difference. First of all, when you're writing, once you've written the screenplay, it may have to be more selling. You're going to give this to people who may not have the same understanding of story that those who read it in the development stage will have. All right. So after finishing the script, and even when the film is finished, an entirely different type of synopsis will be written. But I don't think this is an answer to your question. When you're developing, you're really writing the synopsis for yourself. Remember what I said in the beginning of our session? I said that you need to keep your documents in sync to make sure that there is that causational link, there's the flow, that it all makes sense when you go back to the synopsis. So you do a lot of rewrites there. I hope that answers your question. So, and if it doesn't, then feel free to put another one in there. Tom asks, where can we read the synopsis of produced films? Well, the problem is that if you go to IMDb, you have the tagline versions that are like half a, it's just a paragraph, and then you have the 10,000 word versions. You don't really get the one-pagers. I was a journalist, a film critic for a long time, and the film companies, the distributors, would provide a publicity pack, and that would often include a synopsis. And if the company had done their work, it would often include a one-page synopsis and a long synopsis, to a three-page synopsis. I'll put an example of that in the ebook. I've got one for the wonderful movie Be Kind, Rewind. So you can see what they look like when they come from the production company. Mark asks, how do you know if you've created a solid, great synopsis? Is it okay to go back and write a brand new one, either if you feel your script deviated from what you originally wanted to write, or to redo a new synopsis and therefore rewrite, create a better new script? Well, that's the whole development game. That's the spiel. You write your synopsis, you write your script. It may change. You go back to your script, go back to your synopsis, and so forth. So yeah, obviously it is fine. It's okay. And even if you've already sent that synopsis to someone, don't worry. Ultimately, you are serving the story. You're not serving people. And you include how the story ends. Yes, I hope I was clear about that. Don't end with an air of mystery. No, you don't end with an air of mystery if you are trying to get your script sold, because the people you're selling to have no time to read the whole script if they don't know that the story is going to work, that the end is going to work. So yes, do include the ending. It's different if the distribution company is going to use a synopsis to sell the film or to advertise the film. Then you'll have half-page synopses. If you back of a DVD, that's often a half-page synopsis, something like that. Craig asks about thresholds. Can you please elaborate what that is? I'm going to do a whole webinar about thresholds. I've decided it'll be later in the year, probably second half of the year, but it's a big topic. In short, a threshold is a term from Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's when the hero goes into a new stage, goes into a new world. The biggest thresholds are going from Act 1 into Act 2, going from the ordinary world into the special world. But essentially, every sequence may have a threshold. Every scene can have a threshold of a different magnitude. And in our films, in our stories, we make those visible. We make them visual, but they are essentially psychological thresholds. So basically, the character moves geographically at the same time when the character moves on psychologically. That's really the basic of it. But I'd love to do a whole webinar on that. Victoria says, in TV writing, should we write a synopsis for the whole series and then another one for the episodes? Great question. I'd say yes. I'm not an expert in television, and maybe I should play it back to you guys. There may be some people on the call here who have more experience in that. You would definitely write an episode synopsis, because the episode really needs to convey, or the synopsis for the episode needs to convey the structure. Can you do a synopsis for the whole series? Probably not, because when you're selling the series, when you're writing your Bible, you don't have an ending. Okay, so you could write a synopsis for a season. I'll go back to the camera now. So yes, you could do a synopsis for a TV series season, but it's hard to do for a whole series. There, the character descriptions are more important, because ultimately the stories will come from the characters. Clive says, if you think your show has a surprise ending, then surprise us in synopsis. Absolutely. If you have a strong twist, then give us the twist, convince us that it's going to work. Because no one is going to spend their money to see whether it works. Gita asks, your synopsis just has a storyline, not the B storyline. That depends. If you have a story that's very straightforward, a single point of view, you may be able to include a B storyline. If your story has a lot of characters and a lot of subplots, you may have to cut some out. It really depends on the type of story. It depends on how much time, how much space you need for your setup. If your first act setup eats up a third or half of your synopsis, you will definitely have to cut any subplots. Clive says, synopses on IMDb are often written by fans. They're not useful for our purposes. That's absolutely correct. And in that respect, it'd be a good exercise to look at the long synopsis for Nightcrawler on IMDb, which I have used as a basis, but I've rewritten it. And you'll see how I've changed the style, have cut out what I've cut out, and I've brought it back to a very minimal 500 words. I think that's it. Yeah, do we have more questions? We're going towards the end of the hour, so it's almost time to wrap up. I'd like to answer one more question. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'll make that ebook available of last webinar. I did a webinar 2 weeks ago about productivity. And thank you for your emails. That was really amazing. I'd like to know whether there's anyone on the call today who was on the webinar and has tried any of the tips that I gave. So did anyone venture into the productivity routine, the discipline? In the meantime, I'll give you that offer for the webinar replay, as well as the ebook and the checklist and worksheet. So who was there? Glenn, you were on the productivity webinar. Did you take anything out of that? Karina, okay, I've got a question from Karina here. What specifically do you mean about character psychology? Can you give an example of this described in synopsis? Yeah, the example will be in the Nightcrawler synopsis, but let me see if I can bring it up on the screen here. Okay, this is improvising. Nightcrawler one-page synopsis. Yeah, this is an older version, but I'll look at this one. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Where is it? This should be it. There we go. Not this. That's going to go. This one. Let me see. Yeah, you should be able to see this. See if I can make it bigger. No, it didn't work. So The opening of this one is Los Angeles, present day. Louis Bloom struggles to make a living. He can't get a job, so he steals and pawns, cuts fences, and sells them as scrap. He's brazen and smart, but things haven't quite worked out for him yet. So these three lines kind of combine his character setup and his sociology and psychology, right? So he's at the bottom ladder of society, but he's brazen and smart. That's his psychology. Okay, I haven't described his physiognomy, which is what needs to be added to it. So these mid-20s, that's one thing for sure that needs to be added here. So age is one of the critical aspects. I hope that answers your question. Yes, good. So we've got a few people here who were on the webinar. Glenn started his mornings in a similar manner to how okay, so you're starting. Good, makes a big difference. Great. Very happy to hear that. Now, I'd like to hear, obviously, what sort of difference it makes. Glenn, if you could elaborate maybe now or in an email, I'd love to hear how that productivity discipline is helping your writing, because that was the whole idea. Ian, if we've already paid for the ebook of this seminar, I assume it will be in the mail. Absolutely, yeah. The ebook doesn't exist yet. I'm going to incorporate your questions as much as possible in the webinar. Can you increase the size, please? Trish, are you? You meant the size of the text, sorry. Good. Beatrice, you need to send me an email so I can make sure you get that ebook. Gita says, last webinar offer says $19 when I click the link. Yeah, it said 26. That's because you're in Australia and we are totally stuffed with the exchange rate. $19 is US, so it's clear for everyone. Yeah, it's a US. It was $9, it's gone up to 19. If you're there during the webinar, you have the $9 offer. So I'm not offering you guys this webinar yet, but I'll email you with the $9 offer, and it's also the only time ever it'll be at this price, so it will only increase. By the way, if you would be interested in the adaptation ebook that is still available, I'll put a link in the email. I was going to put it here, but that's just going to take us a little bit too far. We're going very closely to the hour. I'd like to wrap up on the hour if we can. Good. All right, so we have had a steady 62 people on the call today. That is great. Thank you guys for joining in. As I said, I'm going to email you with the link to the replay, which you'll get for free forever, and the ebook, which will be at $9 for you guys. It'll be $19 later, and even to $39 after that. So this is your final opportunity to get that at the ridiculous price of $9. And this is how I can do these webinars. Obviously, there must be some back end, because a lot of work goes into the preparing of the ebooks, and they will be revised as well. So give me your feedback. I'd like to hear your feedback on the webinar as well. I'm sorry about the issues with sound at the beginning. I'll try and figure out what the issue was there. Looking forward to the next webinar. Sorry about that. The next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time. It'll be more a general type of webinar like productivity. Next session will be about building your website as a creative. That's a question I've had from a lot of people, because I've built a lot of websites myself, and many writers want to know how you do that without spending thousands of dollars. So the idea is to build a website during the webinar. I'm actually going to do everything with you guys. I'm going to register the domain name, and I know it's risky, it's asking for trouble, but I'm sure it will work. We'll register the domain name, we'll set up hosting, we'll choose a template, and we'll actually get a website online during the webinar in 2 weeks' time. So that's the idea. And then in 4 weeks' time, we'll have a screenwriting webinar again. And I need to check what the topic is going to be. I'll email you what that may be. The thresholds will be one. I think it's writing active characters. I think that's the one. I think we'll be talking about writing active characters in 4 weeks' time, building website in 2 weeks' time. All right. Thank you all. Great to have you. Have a wonderful weekend. And obviously, I'm hoping to see you all again in 2 weeks' time. Bye.